Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our With All and In Between Artists in Conversation talks. I am very, very excited to be in conversation with Nydia Blas, one of our artists from the show, and just wanted to take an opportunity to talk to you about your work that's in the show, but also just your work overall, who you are as an artist, um, and what compels you to create. So I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself, and then we can get started.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Nydia Blas. I am an artist. I work mostly in photography, but also video, some collage, and I've been playing around with some sculpture, I guess, kind of elements in my new studio that I finally have. But I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm an assistant professor of photography at Spelman College, which I'm so excited to be at. I also teach other workshops and do a lot of artist talks for colleges in different places. Besides that, what else do I do? I'm also like a freelance editorial photographer,
Hmm.
um, a bunch of stuff. I'm just photo everything at this point, which is exciting.
That's really cool. I did not know the editorial photography piece,
Yeah,
but it sounds like you keep quite busy between teaching and doing your work. Um,
I do.
so with all and in between was really the theme was connection, connection through touch, intimate touch, communication, and then connection broadly through culture. And so when we look at your work, particularly your the two pieces that we selected from your In the Blue Light series,
Mhm.
immediately it speaks to connection to us, I think. And so wanted to hear a little bit more about those two pieces. Um, but really for me, when I look at some of the other pieces from that series, it's really telling a larger story. And so I want to hear a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so that series, the work was actually made in 2015 when I was still in graduate school in New York at Syracuse University. Really started off as more of like a commission between a friend and I. So he said, I'll fly you down to DC, where he's from. Come spend the weekend with me, but like photograph me and photograph my family. And so during quarantine, I started to look over my archive and things that I hadn't really used or really spent much time looking at. I was sort of in the process. I work really intuitively, so I kind of make and make, and then I sort of have things that I have to kind of make sense of after the fact. um, but I think in saying that if there's one thing that all my work is really about, it's intimacy. And when I say intimacy, I don't just mean like love and all that like great stuff, but intimacy is sticky, intimacy is scary, intimacy is many things. And so all those layers and levels, and really this notion of complicating sort of whatever it is I'm doing, in terms of one, what the subject matter is when I'm telling stories in the way that I tell stories that are complicated in themselves. And then I also think for us to like look at images and get it be engaged with them, that there's something that has to be complicated there, or something that has to make us want to look longer, or else it's very easy to like, a picture of flowers, it's beautiful, but we've seen pictures of flowers, right? Like easily read, we move past it. So that series really came together in quarantine. I was looking back over it, and then I made like an edit out of all those images that I had just really taken in that one weekend. And so really about my friend Ricky's, but these like different layers and levels of intimacy. So it's interesting that you say connection, um, because in that series, there are images that are of him by himself, right? Sort of like this inner reflection, inner space, inner, literal time and space that made in the photographs. And then him with like a possible lover or, other person. And then the other layer then is him with his family. And so those three different layers of intimacy and creating like a physical space for the subjects to reside in, and sort of then how do those things play against and with each other to reveal, partially, I guess, his story, and then like really larger themes in the world that you sort of talked about with the exhibition. But in the blue light, was always, I have always saved these like titles in my head. I always have like things written down from songs, or I always think that that morning light, that blue light, it's like a blue light that comes in the window is really like the most beautiful light ever. And it's often a time in the morning, like a space to contemplate, often a time, a space where you're by yourself, or you can be with family or with another person, like a lover or something. And so, and then also thinking about what the color blue means, can mean trust, it can mean
Mm.
security. And so that's kind of where the name came from.
Wow, that just in hearing so much of that, there's so many things that dinged in my mind hearing you say that, because thinking about the complicated nature of intimacy and connection, especially intimacy through touch, and how this came together for you in quarantine.
Hmm.
And just the nature of quarantine was that we could not be
Right.
in physical contact, or it was prohibited and cautioned for us to be in contact and connected to friends, intimate partners, all of that. I mean, it was a very scary time for a lot of people, because we didn't
Hmm.
know a lot about the nature of COVID-19 and what we were going through in this pandemic. And so that to hear you talk about the complicated nature of that, and that family dynamic aspect. But hearing you say in the blue light, so made me think about the film Moonlight. And
Hmm.
so, if I'm correct, I could butcher this, but I believe it is the film is adapted from a stage play, which is Black Boys Look Blue in the Moonlight.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so when I heard In the Blue Light and I thought of, the subject of that work, the tying in of Black masculinity and vulnerability and queerness into other aspects, other layers, as you said, of other pieces from that work, it all just kind of came together for me in that way. So it was really interesting to hear you speak of it in that way.
Yeah, I think when you just said that, it's funny. I just showed my students. We're working on a project related to film, so we saw clips from that film yesterday, actually.
Oh,
So that's
cool.
that you brought that up, but I didn't know that about the screenplay. Also, when you just mentioned that, it made me realize I did that with a few different projects during quarantine. Like went back into the archive and made sense of stuff that I hadn't made sense of because I didn't have the time or the space. And so it's funny because the other project that came out of quarantine too was a series of photographs called For Black Girls That Want to Die But Would Never Hurt Themselves. And so it's funny that you say that, because that was another thing sort of experienced during quarantine, sort of that like depressive sort of state, like where you're, I think we probably all went through that, where we're feeling alone or feeling not quite like ourselves or in this state of depression. So it's funny that, both of, some of the projects that came out of quarantine were reflective of how I was feeling at the time, which I didn't think of.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, do you think that there is, in terms of your work overall, um, some connection to yourself personally in all of those works? Your identity, where you're from, geographically, your ethnic heritage, all of that. Do you see that show up in your work? Is that something personal or?
Yeah, I think at the root of it all is personal, because that's the way that, uh, that all of those things where I grew up, my identity, that has shaped really my lens of the world. I like to call it a lens, and it's just the way that we tend to look at the world and the things that we've just noticed. So I grew up in a predominantly white college town, Ithaca, New York. It's home to like Cornell University.
Mhm.
My family has been there for like 100 years. My great grandfather used to work at Cornell, and my great grandmother used to stay home and take in laundry for professors' wives, right? And so I think also I have a family that ranges very much, also in like skin tone and the actual way that we look, from very light skin to dark skin. And so like, and also being in a predominantly white space, I think I just noticed race from like really early on. I just it was something I was always like sort of questioning. And so I think that that's one. And then also growing up in a home that was filled with pictures was a big thing in my house. So having actual early connection and contact with photographs, like having this, like I always think of it as like this proof that I came from greatness, and how, what my people look like and where do I
Mhm,
fit in that
mhm, mhm.
trajectory. And then I also think gender was something, that also never stuck, fit well in my head. Like it just didn't make sense to me. I think also being like a mom when I was 18, but being like a teenage mom and seeing some of the ways that I was treated or how gender played out. And so, yeah, I think all of that is really at the root of my work. I think even my subjects that I photograph, there's like this personal element, then this sort of like group collective element that I'm always speaking to too. So yeah, I think at the root, and I really think at the root of most artists' work is really themselves in some shape or form. And I think we all deal with that, or how much we deal with that like varies.
Yeah,
But yeah.
I would totally agree. I think it's either personal experience or personal perspective, and a way of viewing the world, and how observation impacts opinion and perspective of worldview.
Mhm.
So with that, you talk about identity and place. One of my favorite quotes is Nina Simone. An artist's responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times.
Mhm.
So you speak a little bit about how In the Blue Light and your other photo series came out of quarantine and what you were going through. I wonder, though, if you also felt, quarantine was also a time of political and social unrest at the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and so many other people during that time. Whether you felt there was some level of uh, responsibility to incorporate that into your work, um, or anything like that.
Yeah, I think for sure, and I think I turned to deal with some of that with video, so some video work that I was making. I think really after Micaiah Bryant, that's like where I really lost it, and like I, have a daughter, and Dante Wright, like I have a son who's 21 and a daughter who's 16, and that was like really like I'm also, I am definitely like an empath. I'm definitely a Scorpio water sign. So those things like hit me like on a deep level, like in bed crying for days, like kind of level. And so I think that the art and the ability to make is like how I deal sort of with that energy.
Mm,
And I think more it will be writing, right? So I'm coming out with my second book, and it's like the first time that I've really written. It's about the South, and so like I wrote this whole piece sort of on the South and about slavery, and so I've always been hesitant to, I think, sort of use words, because I always thought that photographs took the place of words, and so I think I'm stepping into that a little bit more. But I think the main thing is that my way I think to respond is for my photographs to work as sort of a counter narrative, right? So if we think of Black folks in America not being able to create the first images of themselves, right? And had images made of them that were meant to promote white supremacy, that were meant to prove that Black folks are inferior, right? All of these things is that I feel like photographs are always working against that grain then. So my job, I think, is to create a counter narrative to all of those other kinds of images, a counter narrative that is true, that is honest, that is complicated, that doesn't just present one thing, but reveals that people are, and relationships and situations are layered. And that's really dependent upon sort of this card that we're dealt, in the world that's not of our choosing, right? Like we don't choose our body,
exactly.
we don't choose our race, our gender, our class, what our body is even going to look like in its shape and its thickness,
Mhm,
its thin, right? But all of these things affect the way that we're received and then treated in the world. And then we have to navigate that and navigate, ourselves, our self-esteem, who we are, what we do. And so I always think of, my work as sort of, unlayering those layers.
mhm. Yeah, I think, you know, I personally speaking will experience a lot of guilt in the midst of last summer,
Mhm.
feeling like I knew so many people who were out in the streets here in
Mhm.
Richmond, literally every night,
Yep.
for weeks, and feeling like I should be out there with them before I had to realize and reflect that, I felt that we were in the midst of a revolution and that everyone plays a different part in that.
Yep.
And that myself, self-identifying as an artist and a writer, that was a space that I could express and create, um, and that was my way of contributing to that
Yep.
revolution. So it's so wonderful to hear you say that and speak about the different ways that we can contribute, and create as a part of that as artists. So
Yeah.
um,
I felt
how
that too. I felt the
yeah,
same
so
thing.
also, you talk about being an educator.
Mhm.
So what, how do you balance that aspect of your identity as well, the artistry and the educator? And are you teaching art,
Yeah.
photography?
Yes, I teach photography. Yeah. Which is interesting because I am more like the artist, like creating quiet and alone by myself. But teaching is very much like acting, right? Like you have to like put on, and so it's like an interesting, it's very rewarding, but it also makes me tired a lot of the time. Like when I teach all day, I'm like, I'm exhausted. I need to like look at TikTok
Yeah.
for a little bit. Um, but yeah, so I teach photography at Spelman, which is just great. It's an honor to teach. Really, like the work that a project that I'm known for is called The Girls Who Spun Gold, which is a result of a girl empowerment group that I created, co-created with a group of girls in Ithaca, New York. So all girls of African descent that felt like they needed a space for themselves. So we created like what we called girl empowerment group or like girl group. And so when I was in grad school, I started photographing them. And so Spelman just seems like the perfect place to be at, especially coming off of making that work. So yes, back teaching in person, which is great. And I actually just curated an exhibition that opened here at Peter Street Station in Atlanta, Georgia, which is in like Castleberry Hill, close to Spelman. So it's called The Great Return. It just opened on Friday, but it is a collection of student work, and it's all about quarantine and sort of returning to the world after
Mm,
quarantine. So
mm,
one of the things that was really interesting about teaching, I moved to Atlanta, taught one full semester at Spelman, and then the next semester, everything happened. And so, what was nice about that though is that students were at home making photographs opposed to on campus making photographs. So the content of the photographs changed,
ah,
right? Like
uh-huh.
we got to see inside of their homes, we got to see their neighborhoods, we got to see moms and grandparents and siblings, and also I think a special like reflective look at themselves, right? Like a lot of self portraits, a lot of like interior sort of work. And so I was just so excited about that shift that we came up with this notion to have this exhibition. So it's a beautiful exhibition. It takes you sort of through all of the feelings, confinement, freedom, sadness, excitement, self care, family, real life events like protests and stuff that students were at, and then more like conceptual photographs that get at more of those feelings. And so, yeah, so super excited to be there and grow this program. But yeah, and I like Atlanta too. So very
That's so
different.
great. That's really great. Congratulations on the opening. I didn't realize it was so soon.
Thank you.
So congrats on that. Um, I found that I taught for 2 years abroad in the Peace Corps, and I found that education was not a one-way street, that there was a lot that I learned from my students as a part of that.
Yes.
And with you being at Spelman, a historically Black college for Black women, and feeling like a lot of the work that have seen of yours deals with aspects of Black femininity.
Mhm.
What have there been any experiences that you've had where your students have opened something up in you or revealed something in you as an artist about Black femininity that has inspired any work for you?
I mean, well, that's totally part of my pedagogy, right? Is that teaching is definitely a two-way street. Like, it's not about me up here with all the information, because first of all,
Mhm.
I don't have it. I don't have all the information, right? And I have my specialty, or like what I'm especially good at. So sometimes you ask me a question, I'm like, let me Google that, right? Answer. So one, right? But that two, teaching is like this two-way street, and in an intimate sort of environment, right? Which is classroom, that knowledge is something that is shared like in that space. And so one, that's just so important to me. But I think two, always reflecting, or things make it into my work, like just the things somebody could say, or like a way that somebody interacts with somebody, or just those little like things, or how the light comes in the room where I'm teaching is always really beautiful, and then has me thinking. And so I think all the time that's something that is happening. But I think at Spelman, there's just really something magical, just even in the space. To like, photography, historically has been taught as a very like white, old, dead white man centered, field. And so it's really awesome to be able to like interject things that have been left out of historically the photo conversation.
Mhm.
And so I think just being able to see how we exchange knowledge in that space, how, I don't know, there's just something so magical about it. And I know that there's no other place where there's literally a room full of Black women learning photography. Like, I don't know that space. I've never been in that space. And so I think just in itself, that space adds to like the magic that I'm all about. And then that makes its way into my work.
That is really, really beautiful. Um, yeah, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to me, to hear more about your work, and to hear more about your journey as an artist, what inspires you. It's been really, really great. So for people who want to keep in contact with you, either on social media or what have you,
Mhm.
how can people stay in touch?
Yeah, so I have Instagram. It's at Neeksy Beaks, which is my childhood nickname, on Instagram, which I can totally give to you too. And thank you for having me in the exhibition and this conversation. I also have a website, NydiaBlas.com.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna put that up so people can see.
Wonderful.
And yes, thank you so, so much for taking
Yes.
this time. Um, yeah, we're so excited to have your work in the show. It definitely spoke to connection, and I'm glad that we were able to take this opportunity for people who have experienced your work and seen it to really hear from you personally. So,
Thank you for
thank
having
you so,
me.
so much.